Hi, Dr. John Torres here, Dr. John with NBC News on this Facebook Live, and it's what I typically do every Friday and Monday, where I go over headlines you've heard over the past week or so, or particularly over the weekend, get behind those headlines so you have a better understanding of what it means and hopefully what it means for you, your family, and your loved ones to move forward with the pandemic, to get yourself to the position where you're safer, you're healthier, and you help the rest of us get through this pandemic as soon as we can. But this week is going to be a bit different because mainly happened over the last few days, and that's the vaccine. This is what some people are calling essentially an unprecedented historic moment in time for a variety of reasons, which we'll talk about. But what happened, in case you haven't heard it, most people have, I think, is essentially the Pfizer vaccine, which is one of the two front runners in the race for the vaccine for COVID, has been approved, it's been authorized, it's not approved, it's been authorized. It's been recommended by the CDC exactly how to give. Distribution started today, and shots started to be given to people. We saw the first people getting their shots earlier this morning, and they're going to progress throughout the day. So let's talk about this in detail. So this is the first shot. This is the first vaccine that has gotten the emergency use authorization from the FDA. This is a Pfizer vaccine. It's what they call an mRNA vaccine. The one to come behind it is the Moderna vaccine. They've submitted for their emergency use authorization as well with the FDA, and we'll talk about the process they're going to go through this week. That's also an mRNA vaccine. There's some other ones out there like the AstraZeneca one, which is a different type of vaccine. It's more the older technology. And so that's taking a little bit more time, and they're having a few stumbling blocks they're trying to get through. But essentially with the Pfizer vaccine, 44,000 volunteers in their human trials, 22,000, half of them got the vaccine, and that's the data they submitted to the FDA for the emergency use authorization. In case you weren't around last week or didn't hear about how the process worked, there's a committee called the VRBPAC, which is the Vaccine and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee. It's a committee that advises the FDA on whether to go ahead and give an authorization or an approval for a vaccine. In this case, it's an emergency use authorization because we're in a time of emergency. In order to get an approval, that's usually a multi-year process. Here, we don't have that time to wait. We don't have the luxury of time. So they're trying to get a safe, effective vaccine out as soon as they can and giving it a temporary authorization. So VRBPAC, which is a group of independent experts, they're independent from the FDA, met on Thursday, the 10th, and they went through all the data. They'd actually gotten the data a week or so before, and they'd been poring over it for a week ahead of the meeting. They finalized at the meeting, and they gave thumbs up recommendations to the FDA to go ahead and give Pfizer's vaccine emergency use authorization. So on Friday, the FDA did exactly that. They gave them the emergency use authorization. And the way it reads is they are authorizing, through the emergency use basis, this Pfizer vaccine for individuals 16 and above here in the United States. Then what happens is we have to sit here and fine-tune that a little bit because as a doctor, I'm looking for recommendations. Okay, I get it. It's authorized for everybody 16 and above, but there's certain people who probably shouldn't get it, other people that we're not sure if they should get it. So this is where the CDC steps in with their recommendations. And so what happened is on Saturday, ACIP, which is the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. If you've ever looked at an immunization or a shot schedule, especially for children, you'll see at certain ages they recommend certain shots in certain dosings and at certain stages. That is ACIP who does that recommendation. The CDC takes that recommendation and usually signs off on it and says, yes, this is who should be getting a vaccine. Let's use MMR or flu vaccine or any of them. This is who should be getting this vaccine. At this age, they should get it. And their booster shot should be done this far away from the first vaccine, this far apart. Same thing happened here. ACIP went through and they gave recommendations for the Pfizer vaccine. And then the CDC signed off on those recommendations. And we'll go over those in just a little bit. But, so essentially what's happening now is it's gotten its emergency use authorization, it's gotten its from the FDA, it's gotten its recommendations from the CDC, and now that it has those recommendations, people are starting to get shots in certain phases. And those phases are happening along the lines of what the CDC had recommended with some alterations that states are using depending on where they are and how many vaccines they actually got. Because remember, Pfizer is a 2-dose vaccine regimen. So that means that if they have 20 million vaccines, which they don't get, but they think they'll have that by the end of the year, that's only 10 million people. And so they have to be careful as to who gets it because not everybody can get it all at the same time. So what the CDC said during the recommendations is people 16 and above should get this shot. But the shot was not tested on women that were pregnant or women that were breastfeeding. And so what they are recommending, especially women who might be pregnant and who are now in a position where they're at high risk for COVID, they're in one of the phase 1 groups, as in a healthcare worker, then they should sit down with their doctor and go over the pluses and minuses of getting this vaccine since they're pregnant. And then they can make an informed decision as to what to do at that point. So they're not saying pregnant women should not get the vaccine. They're saying pregnant women should get all the information and then make an informed decision as to whether they want to get the vaccine at that point. But no studies have been done on pregnant women, so we don't know the safety or the effectiveness on vaccines at this point. But we can extrapolate, which is a big word that the FDA and this VRBPAC, the advisory committee, used, to the data we have to see that, more than likely in pregnant women, it's going to be safe, it's going to be effective. Studies have not been done, so we can't say that with 100% surety. And so that's where the recommendation stands right now. Now, the other thing you might have heard of is in the UK, they started giving their shot about a week before we did. In the UK, there were actually on day 1, 2 severe allergic reactions. Those were healthcare workers. Those healthcare workers had a history of severe allergies in the past. And so they actually carried EpiPens with them all the time to save their life in case they needed it. And they had reactions to this vaccine, were given epinephrine, and are doing better right now. They've recovered. Because of that, the UK put out word, if you've had an allergic reaction if you have severe allergies, do not get this vaccine. Well, here in the U.S., they looked at it a little closer and they said, I don't think we need to go quite that far. So what we're going to recommend is here, and I'll go through it just to make sure I'm getting it the way it is. Don't take the vaccine if you had a severe allergic reaction to any component of the vaccine. Now, it's a little tough because there's a lot of components in there. They use a lot of chemical names, and most of us probably don't know what those are, including myself, some of them. So it's one of those things that's going to be hard to tell. Have I ever had an allergic reaction to that 1,2-diethyl, the different chemicals they have there? So in particular, what they're saying is that some people seem to have an allergic reaction to polyethylene glycol. So if you have a reaction to that, don't take this vaccine. But they also went on to say, for people with a history of severe allergic reactions to another vaccine or an injectable medication, you want to talk to your doctor about the risk-benefit thing, kind of like the same thing they recommended for pregnant women. But if you have an allergy to food products, if you have allergies to bees or latex, and they were mild to moderate allergies, go ahead and take this vaccine because it's not going to show any issues. It didn't show any issues in the clinical trials, and the CDC doesn't think that'll cause any problems. However, they're going to keep monitoring it. Now, the other side effect you might have heard about are the Bell's palsy side effect. Bell's palsy is a facial nerve issue. It usually causes temporary facial paralysis in people. There were 4 people in the study that had Bell's palsy. Again, this is 4 people out of 22,000 people that got the vaccine. That is around the numbers that the normal population would have as well. And so it's hard to tell if it's directly related to the vaccine or to just what would normally happen to people who hadn't, even if they hadn't gotten the vaccine, they probably would have gotten Bell's palsy. However, out of an abundance of caution, the CDC is saying we're going to move forward and study this, take a good look at this, but for now we don't think there's any connection between that. So that's where the recommendations stand right now for this vaccine. But what does that mean as far as numbers of the vaccine that are out there? Well, right now we have 100 million doses scheduled to be delivered from Pfizer. If you remember last week, or if you didn't hear about it, the Trump administration, Operation Warp Speed, went back to Pfizer and said, we want to exercise an option we have to buy another 100,000. And Pfizer said, unfortunately, all our vaccines are allocated out right now until June, so we wouldn't be able to do that until June. Moderna, which is the next vaccine to come along, has not done that same thing, and so they exercise an option for another 100 million of Moderna on top of the original 100 million. So within the next few months, we're going to have 300 million vaccines between Moderna, 200 million, and Pfizer, 100 million, which will cover 150 million people. By the end of the year, we're expected to have 40 million vaccines. That will cover 20 million people. By some estimates, in that first phase, which are typically healthcare workers and those in long-term care facilities, there are 24 million people in that category. So that's going to fall a little bit short, but those numbers of vaccines are popping up very quickly, and they're producing them as fast as they can. What states have done, so the CDC came out with recommendations. They're phase 1. Their phase 1 were healthcare workers, frontline healthcare workers, and then those living in long-term care facilities. And then they're going to go down other phases, which are probably going to be essential workers, those with conditions that put them at higher risk for having complications for COVID-19, and then the general population. But since states are getting only a small amount of the numbers they need, at least in this first week, they are allocating them in different ways depending on the state, depending on the county, even depending on the hospital system itself. There was one on the East Coast that was doing a lottery system. They had 900 vaccines, and they had around, I believe it was around 10,000 people they needed to vaccinate. And so you can see the disparity there, so they decided to have a lottery system. Others are looking at it here in Colorado. They're saying phase 1 is going to be divided into 3 different stages. Phase 1A are going to be those healthcare workers that are directly involved with a COVID patient and exposed to that COVID patient or COVID patients for 15 minutes or more a day. Those are the ones at highest risk of contracting COVID or getting coronavirus. The next stage will be long-term care facility residents, and then after that will be other healthcare workers who are not directly involved with COVID patients for 15 minutes a day. And so you can see states are varying the way they're doing this based on the numbers they have. Those numbers of vaccines should crop up pretty quickly. And so I think you're going to see people getting the shots very, very rapidly here. And I think you're going to see more of an acceptance of the vaccine as more and more people get them, and we notice that side effects aren't that bad. However, I do want to talk a little bit about the side effects just because expectations, I think, are everything. And if you go in expecting to have some minor side effects and you have those, that's a different story than if you go in expecting everything to be great and you have no and you do have those minor side effects, then you're going to think something's wrong with the vaccine when in fact it's not. Any vaccine you get, for the most part, does produce minor side effects. And that's usually a day or two after you get the vaccine. That's your immune system kicking in and producing what it needs to produce to fight off the virus. But when it does that, it is initially doing what it normally does to fight off a virus. So it starts ramping up your immune system, starts ramping up your inflammatory system to fight off the virus. Once it realizes it's a vaccine, not a virus, it gets all those back down. It starts quelling them. But in the meanwhile, you do have some symptoms, and these are usually minor symptoms. People are complaining about injection site soreness. People are complaining about headaches and fatigue and muscle aches. Those are the big ones. Most people said it happened on the second shot, usually a day or two afterwards, and only lasted about a day or two. Now, what the CDC is saying is if you start getting those, number one, expect to have them, because I believe the latest number was 83% of people had at least one of those symptoms. You can take ibuprofen or acetaminophen if you want to go ahead and resolve those symptoms once they start up. But they also recommend not taking ibuprofen or acetamin to start with to try and prevent those from happening. Because if you do that, then they don't really know what that'll do to your immune system. Because there is the theory out there that if you take ibuprofen or acetaminophen before getting the vaccine, your immune system won't be able to mount the robust attack on the vaccine and subsequently the virus that we want it to. And so they're saying get the vaccine, wait a day or so until you start noticing these symptoms, and then at that point, take ibuprofen or acetaminophen. One recommendation is let your work know that you might be calling off the day after you get the vaccine because you might not feel too well, but usually, again, resolves within a day or two. So looking at this real quickly, again, vaccine distribution is a huge thing right now. People are starting to get the vaccine. The distribution program is kicking in. This shot, which is the Pfizer shot, is a little hard to distribute because it has to be at the ultra cold minus 70 degree Celsius temperature. The one to come Moderna, which is going to follow up this week with its emergency use authorization, can be at regular refrigerator temperatures like you have in your kitchen. And so it's going to be easier to transport, distribute, and store. And that's coming starting Thursday. You'll probably see those shots in arms a week from now, and then we'll start really getting people ramped up. Remember, we need around 70% or more of people to get the vaccine before we get this pandemic under control. The sooner we get that high of number, the sooner we can get back to our normal lives. Things can open up and we can get back to enjoying the things we always enjoy. Let me see if you have any questions.
How long does the vaccine last?
So that's a great question. How long does the vaccine last? And we don't know at this point, and we won't know because the way biology works is we won't find out until that time passes. So what they're going to do is they're going to monitor people to look at their antibodies, to see if their antibodies are decreasing over time. And not just their antibodies, another part of the immune system called T cells. See if those are decreasing because the T cells actually help the body recognize the infection and start producing antibodies, and see if those stay high or start decreasing. Once they start decreasing, then they can say, might be time for a booster shot. But the other thing they're going to look at is they're going to monitor the virus as it starts circulating around the globe. We don't think this virus is going to be eradicated. To date, We've only eradicated one virus in the history of mankind, and that's the smallpox virus. And it took a huge effort globally for decades to get that eradicated. So more than likely, this will not be eradicated, but it'll be under control, much like we do with measles, mumps, those types of things. People get vaccinated. We don't see the outbreaks we used to see 100 years ago. So because of that, they'll monitor the virus to see if the virus changes. If the virus changes, then they might say we need a booster shot as well. But from all indications, and again, this is that word extrapolate, extrapolating the data we have now, they think this vaccine will last a few years, 2, 3, maybe even more years, and we won't need a booster shot until that point. The good news is if it does last 2, 3, or 5 years, that's a time frame we can get this pandemic under control, and then we can figure out what we need to do at that point. But for the most part, we think it's going to last more than just a year, but we're not sure how much more.
What's Bell's palsy you were talking about?
So Bell's palsy, it's a nerve issue that happens with the face. And a lot of times it happens if you get a virus. It can happen occasionally with vaccines. And sometimes it happens and we don't really know why it happens. But essentially what happens is you get paralysis or partial paralysis of one side of your face or the other. And when they come into the emergency room, for example, they'll come in and will initially not know they have a stroke or Bell's palsy. There's some signs that show us it's Bell's palsy. For the most part, especially if it's caught early on and given some treatment, it is a self-resolving, or it's a resolving, sometimes self-resolving condition that goes away. Unfortunately, sometimes people are left with some deficits, but for the most part, it's something that goes away either with medication or on its own. So,
if you've already had COVID, should you get the vaccine?
this is a great question, and the CDC addressed this question. And they said, yes, if you've had COVID, you need to get the vaccine because we don't know if you have COVID, what level of protection you have, because it depends on how much virus you got, how severe your symptoms were, how well your immune system fought it off. All those different things can add to whether you have a robust response or not, whether you have continuing antibodies or not, and how long those last. And so we don't know if you have COVID, which is what we call a natural immunity, how long that's going to protect you or how well that's going to protect you. But we do know with the vaccine that you get a certain baseline level of protection. And right now it looks like it's great protection, 95% effective. They've looked at both the T cells and the antibodies and seen a very robust response there. And so it's looking like the vaccine can protect you more so than getting COVID. So they want everybody to go ahead and get the vaccine just to make sure we're all on the same level. One thing they are saying though, if you have COVID, 90 days after you have COVID, so for that 3-month period, you're very unlikely to get a second infection, a reinfection. So one option they said is if you happen to be in one of those phase 1 groups and you want to save the vaccine for other people in the phase 1 group, then delay your vaccine for 90 days. Listen to me carefully. This is delay your vaccine for 90 days, not don't get the vaccine. So at the end of that 90-day period, you need the vaccine to protect yourself. And so again, this is one of those things as an option. You can delay it for 90 days to let other people get the vaccine while they're ramping up production. But remember, at the end of that 90 days, you need to get that vaccine regardless. And so this is just a temporary delay in getting the vaccine, not an elimination of getting the vaccine. But these have been fantastic questions. I'll be continuing to answer questions on NBC News and all our platforms throughout the week. And we'll have another Facebook Live come Friday talking about the different things that have gone on and where Moderna is, because then they'll be in the middle of their emergency use authorization process. My guess is by Friday they'll be getting their emergency use authorization from the FDA and looking at the CDC for recommendations. But as of right now, Pfizer, the first one to be authorized here in the United States. Shots in arms are starting to happen. You're seeing the distribution really ramping up and these vaccines going to a variety of places across the country. People are getting vaccinated, which is great. We need to make sure those numbers continue to increase over the weeks and months to come. And for most people, I think you're going to be looking at March or April timeframe for getting your vaccine. And so please think considerably about getting it. If you have questions, talk to your doctor, go online to reputable sites and look at information, and certainly listen to us at NBC News. We talked about the side effects that happen, minor for the most part, minor side effects, injection site soreness, fatigue, headaches, muscle aches, typically go away after a day and a half, usually happen more after the second shot. And then we talk about the phases that are happening. Again, for most of us, we'll be getting them in April. But this is great news. It is one of those things that we're starting to see that light at the end of the tunnel. And I quoted it last Friday. I'll quote it again today. It's something Winston Churchill said when the Brits were both looking at making sure that they were saving their lives, they were saving their country during World War II, and they had won a big battle, but it was at the beginning of the war. And Winston Churchill wanted to make sure that people understood we still have a long ways to go. And the same thing here. We still have a long ways to go. Masks, social distancing, washing your hands, small group gatherings, if that, stay home for the most part, are what we need to do to keep this under control while more and more of us get the vaccine. But in his case, it was World War II. He wanted to make people understand, hey, we still have a ways to go here. And so I'm going to give you his quote and leave you with his quote. Basically, he said, now is not the end. It's not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. And I think that's where we are. We're at the end of the beginning of the pandemic. And so now we move into that second stage of really getting it under control. And then the third stage of getting back to our normal lives or near normal lives. But in the meanwhile, for the rest of this week, and this is a big holiday month, and so please enjoy the month as best you can, but stay safe and keep everybody around you safe. But for you, your family, your loved ones, please stay as happy and as healthy as you can. Thanks.